The Paul Leslie Hour, helping people tell their stories. And now, your host, Paul Leslie.
Hey, it's me. On this episode of the Paul Leslie Hour, we're continuing our travel on the song lines, and we make a turn on the Clarinet Road. Our guest, Evan Christopher, is a musician, performing and recording artist, a composer, and advocate of the New Orleans clarinet tradition. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, Paul.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you for asking.
It's good to have you. So you have California beginnings.
That's true. Everybody got to be from somewhere.
What part of California?
So I was born and raised in Long Beach, California, just a little bit south of Los Angeles.
Okay. And are your parents musical people?
Not particularly.
No?
I think my dad had fondness for the big band vocalists and some of that music, some early jazz. And my mother was kind of in that era. She was among the people that were kind of enthusiasts of the folk movement.
Folk music.
Well, I guess in the record collection, so there was some Artie Shaw on my dad's side, and there was some Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie on her collection.
Interesting. So, why the clarinet?
Well, first was piano. I took piano lessons when I was really little, but to be in the school band, I wanted to pick an instrument, and so in middle school, the clarinet suited me because I was a little young for my grade and small for my age.
Are you grateful that you had that piano foundation?
Oh, absolutely, and I still use it for as a tool for arranging and composing. And it was very visual. It made learning the clarinet easier. I think the other thing about clarinet was just that physically it was an attractive instrument. It was the only one of the woodwinds that was actually made of wood, and the metalwork was it was just a charming instrument.
And when you were starting out, what were the players? Who were the players that made you?
Well, when I was starting out, I actually had to turn to the record collection to hear what it was supposed to sound like. And although I think I checked out some LPs of classical music from the public library, I think the only places that I heard clarinet were on some LPs that included Artie Shaw, some of the Bluebird recordings from the 30s with his big band, and I think there was the ubiquitous Ackerbilk record, and there was Hot Fives LP of on Columbia with some of the with Johnny Dodds, of course, on most of it.
And the decision that you made at some point that you were going to move to Louisiana.
Well, the decision was made just because I was just knocked out the first time I ever visited the city. I was touring right after college, even on the cusp of finishing college. I was working and touring with a singer-songwriter from San Diego, California, and we ended up with a tour that stopped at Tipitina's for a show, and it was the summer of 1994, and because we had arrived a day early from Chicago, I actually don't really want to know how fast we were driving to make that, but woke up on the tour bus in New Orleans, and it was like I was in another world. Just the humidity that you can cut with a knife, and everything sticking out of the ground, crooked as can be, and I met so many young players, or players at least my age at the time. I was in my early 20s, who were enthusiasts of traditional New Orleans music. Some of them were from New Orleans, and some of them weren't, and it seemed like there would be plenty of opportunities to perform that music that I liked.
And the recordings that have been made that we think of being clarinet-centric, which ones do you think are shining examples?
The recordings that were clarinet-centric. Now, most of the early jazz that features some of the New Orleans clarinetists, I don't necessarily think they're always at the forefront, but there's something about the early jazz, especially if it features, collective improvisation with the ensemble, and there's a clarinet in there. The way it rides over the top of the texture, it's pretty easy to have your attention drawn to it, I think. So even band recordings like Louis Armstrong's band, although Johnny Dodds is just a supporting player, I mean, he's so clear, and he's so clear in there that for me, the role is almost equally as prominent. So as far as actual clarinet centric records, I mean, of course, I think the trios of Benny Goodman with Gene Krupa and Teddy Wilson are pretty iconic. But I was actually more drawn to the small group sides by Artie Shaw, that his Gramercy 5 and even later versions of the Gramercy 5, like the Decca recordings that came considerably later. I really loved those particular sounds. That's a good question. Some of my other favorite recordings that I was turned on to pretty early on included the Harlem Ham Fats that had clarinet in there as well. And later, I was far more interested in Alcide Yellow Nunez, an Isleño clarinet player from New Orleans, who was kind of around the scene of New York at the same time as the original Dixieland Jazz Band. But those recordings, I didn't dig those as much as I dug the recordings of Alcide Nunez on with the Louisiana 5. Those Louisiana 5 sides were a real for early jazz. They were a real. They're very clarinet centric because there's no trumpet. It's clarinet and trombone instead of trumpet being the lead instrument. And then a lot of trio recordings. So when I was looking for the New Orleans clarinet players, it turned out that many of them played in band settings, but also had their own recordings in small groups. Louis Cottrell Jr. with the Living Legend series on Riverside. Those were magical recordings for me. And when I think about Raymond Burke, of course, he's got some band sides, but there's also a nice trio that he did for 504 Records with Butch Thompson and I don't know. I think there's so many. I don't know about iconic though. That's a tricky one. It kind of depends on what people are into. To be into traditional New Orleans music, or maybe people are more into early jazz records, or maybe people are into more modern clarinet music. I don't know, or swing era music. It's always kind of depends. There's so many sort of subgenres in the traditional styles before World War II, and then don't forget the revival period after World War II that features great clarinetists such as George Lewis and Albert Burbank. I don't know. It's a big palette of clarinet sounds out there that I became fascinated by, and even though Sidney Bechet recorded much more on soprano sax, I always go to his clarinet recordings as being, what was the word used? Iconic. Yeah,
absolutely. I listened and watched the performance you did of Petit Fleur.
Yeah,
great.
More a modern-y version, or
it was a version you did. It was on YouTube.
Mm-hmm. So I had an opportunity in 2009 to go to Paris and be involved in a television jazz award show, and my part was a small tribute to Sidney Bechet. So we did a kind of a more modern version of Petite Fleur, just because I was self-conscious about, well, here it is 2009. I've got to do something a little bit more personal or different. So, but I've recorded it more traditionally also. So I'm not.
Tell us about that experience, the time you spent in France.
There's some ambivalence surrounding my short period of being in France, because it came on the heels of the failure of the federal levies in New Orleans in 2005. So at the beginning of 2006, I had accepted an artist residency on the invitation of the city in Paris and the French-American Cultural Exchange. And so I basically, not knowing when I'd be able to return to New Orleans, or if I was going to, I spent most of 2006 and a good portion of 2007 trying to base myself in Paris. And the ambivalence is because I was, kind of forced to go somewhere else, and I didn't really have a lot. There's a lot of uncertainty in that period, and not much more than a suitcase full of clothes and a couple clarinets. Some stuff I managed to salvage and I put in a storage unit. The other part that was a little disappointing was I wasn't actually going to live in France. I was just it was an artist residency. I was given I was given a small apartment and a little bit of a stipend, and I could kind of do what I wanted. But the program hadn't actually integrated any specific programming. So the burden of making the residency meaningful was kind of on me.
When you're making your own recordings, what is the mission that you have when you go into the recording studio?
That's a good question, Paul. For recording, it's kind of evolved because I think the opportunities I was given to record under my own name with say, the great pianist Dick Hyman or guitarist Bucky Pizzarelli, I felt an obligation to make sure that there were some original pieces represented. And before that, I think it was more about every project has had sort of a different goal. There was a ragtime record. The goal was actually to kind of add or continue the tradition of some ragtime trio tracks created by Tony Parenti. Other projects have been where I'm featured in somebody else's musical group or a band. But my own projects, sometimes there's a narrative built in. For instance, there's 3 recordings I did with a group that I had called Django a la Creole, which was kind of trying to blend the manouche gypsy jazz style with the New Orleans clarinet style, which I based historically on the incident of Barney Bigard getting to record a few tracks with Django in Paris. I think now that that's kind of my goal with recordings is to make sure that there's some element of hybridity, if you will, a couple things that you might not expect to go together, but always coming back to the New Orleans clarinet style. So everyone's different. Every recording ends up being a little bit different goal.
Well, you mentioned 2 artists there a moment ago who have been on this show. Dick Hyman was just maybe a week and a half ago.
Wonderful. That's great.
And I'm hoping you can tell us about working with him.
Well, I've gotten to work with him on and off over a couple decades, and every experience is not only an honor and a great pleasure, but a learning experience as well. So it's and some of the occasions have been very short, where we just get to spend an afternoon together, maybe a rehearsal and then a show, and we don't see each other for a few months. And then there have been other times when we've gotten to hang out a little bit more. Brought him down to New Orleans a couple years ago and had him do a master class at the university, and it's marvelous on not only a musical level, but just the amount of music history that he was there to be a part of firsthand. That's been that's the greatest thing. And for pianists, I can only imagine that just the sheer breadth of vocabulary that he's mastered has got to be pretty awesome too. For me, I appreciate that as well, but I'm sure for a pianist, it's probably really probably really remarkable. So there's that too.
And tell us about Bucky Pizzarelli. What was he like for you to work with?
Bucky's just such a gentleman, and the same thing. His longevity has given him, outside of his virtuosity, his longevity has made him so important for musicians like myself, just to kind of fill in some of those historical gaps. It's really, every time you're with him, you're not even, with very little effort, you're learning more and more about this, the whole, not only the history of the music, but the conditions of the working environments and the industry itself. And not just for jazz too. Dick Hyman, I get great advice about film scoring, and Bucky Pizzarelli, great reminiscences about what it used to be like when radio stations had their own orchestras, and television, when they had their own staff musicians and things like this. And so I think those are the greatest contributions for rank and file cats like me. It's sort of trying to get a glimpse as to just what goes into not only having longevity as a performer, but longevity as a professional.
And we're recording this in Georgia.
Yes, here we are outside of Atlanta.
So tell us about the life of a traveling musician. What is that like for you?
Well, I tell you what, Paul, it's changed a lot in very recent months, because now I have an 18-month-old.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so it's changed a lot. I think Clarinet Road, I was pretty aggressive about using my music as an opportunity to see as much of the world as I could and to be meeting musicians from all over. And I guess that started, those first opportunities came actually in that same period, just as I was moving to New Orleans. There was a couple European tours right after I finished college. And there was opportunities once I got to New Orleans with not only New Orleans musicians, but Europeans who had sort of moved to New Orleans. And I came along at a point where there were fewer veterans for them to showcase internationally. And I was sort of, it was sort of a shift. It was a shift. There weren't as many of the older musicians to take on the road, and there were younger musicians that were very enthusiastic about the style like I was, and it was more economical for them and maybe a little bit easier in some ways too. So it's changed. Being a traveling musician has been fraught with the same things that everybody experiences in international or air travel, with the security stuff, but now it's gotten, for musicians, sometimes it's even harder because of the amount of stuff that we have to drag along with us. And in some ways, things have become a little, much more portable. I mean, I remember in my early days how I'd have to, pick out the handful of CDs or cassette tapes that I wanted to bring. And so there was a box of cassettes and a box of CD, a little envelope of CDs and the CD player and the little Walkman tape recorder. And, you had this whole kind of separate little portion of your luggage devoted to just what you're going to bring with you on the road. Big old headphones. And, now everything's a little more compact. You can put everything on your cell phone practically. So, that's been an interesting change. Playing clarinet's been different because you don't have as many things to carry. In the rare cases, I have to drag along a saxophone. It's not as much fun. I think for me, now that I'm older, or somewhat older, it's trickier. The business has changed. There's definitely no shortage of cats half my age who are willing to work twice as hard for half the money, and that's made it more of a challenge. I also think, Paul, that there's a bit of a ceiling on the income that you can have from just playing gigs and touring. It's become a little harder, at least in this genre of music, instrumental music, and my aesthetic choice to pretty much prefer acoustic, intimate venues. It's become more and more difficult all the time to monetize, as countries all over are having a harder time getting arts funding for presenting music, and especially music that involves international travel for their artists.
Well, what has traveling taught you?
What has traveling taught me? One of my greatest teachers, the bass player Marshall Hawkins, he logged a lot of miles with a lot of different people. And what he taught me, he was my teacher in high school. Even though I didn't play bass, he taught me about jazz harmony and theory. But he also taught me that in the world today, some of our biggest obstacles in not seeing the otherness of other people is being victims of limited experience. And racism is a big bigotry, intolerance. Having opportunities to not be a victim of limited experience through travel and through meeting other people in your travels, I think that's the exposure to other cultures, exposure to cultural traditions. All of this, I think, is really the biggest key to not being limited to only what's familiar to you. That's what I think travel's taught me the most, is to kind of try to go through life being a lot more open-minded and accepting of all the open, not just accepting, but open to all the things that other cultures have to offer us.
When somebody goes to one of your performances, what is the best case scenario that they get from seeing one of your shows?
Wow. Well, boy, what the best case scenario. I think there's a lot of, my goal lately, in the last, 10 years or so, especially 10, 15 years, has been to make sure that that there are actually multiple points of entry into the experience. So I don't know that I think there's necessarily a biggest takeaway, but I think for someone hearing this type of music for the first time, what I want their takeaway to be might be to be excited or curious to learn more about it. Whereas an aficionado coming to a show, my biggest hope for them might be a little bit different. I might hope that they're recognizing a level of nuance that makes them want to maybe spend more time in New Orleans exploring the culture that is kind of behind the making of the music. Or maybe the takeaway, if they're musicians, if they're a clarinet player, maybe the takeaway is to make them excited and curious about expanding, their own musical vocabulary. I think it's different. It depends on where they're coming from as to what I want the takeaway to be. And I think I have the expectation lately of having all of those types of people at shows. I rarely have shows where it's just where a majority of people just don't know anything about me or the music. I rarely have shows where they're not familiar with jazz or not familiar with New Orleans music. It's it's always a nice mix.
What do you think of the clarinet as a solo instrument?
Well, what do I think of the clarinet as a solo instrument? I think it's the greatest instrument. I don't know. I think for myself, I feel like there's been a lot of advantages to focusing on the clarinet. So as a solo instrument, I love the range of colors, timbres, and even just the actual tessitura. The range of the instrument from top to bottom is greater than I feel a lot of other instruments. And then specifically New Orleans clarinet as a solo instrument. Well, there's two sides to that. One, I think it's great because there's so many musicians that have added to the vocabulary of the instrument and created this very regional style. At the same time, I still like it as having a role in the context of the New Orleans ensemble. And so as a solo instrument, I think sometimes I miss that. But I've been more focused on the clarinet in the New Orleans style as opposed to just the clarinet. The clarinet, I love classical clarinet and I love a lot of other ethnic styles of clarinet. But as a solo instrument, I think in the New Orleans style, especially when there's influences of jazz, and improvisation's a big part of it. I think there's a lot more room for diverse approaches to the music.
So for anyone who's listening in, wherever they may be, very open-ended, as we're wrapping up here, what would you say to them? You can go anywhere.
Who are we addressing?
Whoever's listening. Wherever they may be, whenever they may listen.
So music listeners.
Could be.
Or to anybody who might be hearing this. To anybody who might be hearing this. Yeah. Well, I genuinely hope that their appreciation and curiosity for the power of live music is something that they'll explore and embrace. I definitely hope that anybody listening to me or other musicians talk about music, creates enough of a curiosity for them to explore this world of nonverbal communication, because there's so much expressed in this rather abstract language. It has so much power and potential. So I guess that would be what I would wish for anybody who might be hearing this.
So my last question, who is Evan Christopher?
Who is Evan Christopher? Wow. Well, he's just this guy that plays the clarinet, I guess. Evan Christopher is a musician who not only believes in the power of music, but believe strongly in the lessons that the music of New Orleans has to offer people all over the world who might not be as fortunate to be somewhere where music has been the lifeblood of the people of where they live. Evan Christopher's a musician who's a little road weary, maybe, but at the same time, just never wants to miss out on an opportunity to have musical exchanges with other musicians, anywhere in the world, and to explore the possibilities of his chosen instrument. Yeah.
Well, thanks for letting us in.
Paul, thanks for the time, and thanks for letting me talk a little bit about the clarinet.
My pleasure. Till next time.
The Paul Leslie Hour is hosted, produced, and written by Paul Leslie for Lifestyles Entertainment. For information, visit thepaulleslie.com. Thank you for being with us. Until next time.